So in the second half of this lecture, we're going to be talking about 4 macromolecules that are necessary for conducting life as normal. The first 3, carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, are all necessary for you to eat. These you all have to consume in some quantity. And even if you're really trying to avoid one, so say if you're trying to eat a really low carb diet, it's almost impossible to avoid them completely. They're in almost everything that we eat. And nucleic acids are the 4th macromolecule. They are essential for life as normal. And as we've discussed pretty extensively, DNA is passed from your parents. DNA creates RNA. Your body synthesizes the building blocks for DNA and RNA without consuming them directly. So you don't need to consume DNA and RNA. You don't consume DNA from, say, eating a steak or some lamb. And then get that DNA integrated into yours or anything. So nucleic acid isn't necessary to eat, but is still necessary to conduct business as usual. So I wanted to talk really quickly before we dive into this about the difference between atoms and molecules and the difference between elements and compounds. So atoms, as we've said, are a unit of an element. An element is a substance that can't be divided any further and retain its properties. Molecules are made up of bonds between atoms, and so here we have water, or H2O. We have an oxygen atom bonded to 2 hydrogen atoms, and a compound is similar in that you can't break it down any further and retain its properties. However, you can break the bonds between this oxygen and this hydrogen and this oxygen and this hydrogen and still have atoms of oxygen, hydrogen, hydrogen. These still break down. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit of the difference. It's a little bit hard to wrap your head around. So please listen to it several times and think about what you already know regarding the subject. So a carbohydrate is something like a starch, a cellulose, or a sugar. It makes a lot of the structure of our body. So cellulose, for instance, is what creates the structure in plants. They consist of carbons and hydrates. So carbons are located in every one of these corners of this carbohydrate molecule. This is a disaccharide, and here are OH groups, which are negatively charged group that is attracted to this carbon and is derived from water, H2O. So it loses an H, becomes negatively charged, and binds to this carbon. A carbohydrate is made up of many saccharide molecules. And so we talked about this in the context of diabetes, that your liver undergoes glucogenesis and glucolysis. So that is creating starch molecules and breaking down starch molecules. So it's the pathway between monosaccharides and these long polysaccharides. So a polysaccharide is anything with more than 3 monosaccharides bonded together. And here is just 1 monosaccharide. So this is the actual glucose molecule that you are able to use in order to digest in your body and to use for ATP. And so we're going to get that a little bit. Whereas carbohydrates like this that are stored in these starches are the way that we store energy in our body for later use, but they cannot be directly broken down into ATP. They need to go through monosaccharide first. And so that means that when we eat something that's a simple carb, like say if you were just to eat a teaspoon of sugar, then it is going to very quickly spike your glycemic index. That is how much sugar you're able to get out of food very quickly and go directly into your bloodstream, whereas something like a complex carb, so something like whole grain bread or oats or something, is harder to get out, and so it takes longer to break down, and we generally think of these as better for you than things that are super simple like sugar directly. So as I said, complex carbs need to break down into simple carbs, need to break down into glucose. So in order for your body to use that as ATP, and ATP is the body's currency, ATP is what your cells need to do all of the functions that they do. And this process here is called cellular respiration. We're not going to talk about it extensively in this course, but it's really important, and I'm sure that you covered it in other contexts. Lipids, also known as fats, come in the forms of triglycerides. That is 3 fatty acids together, so three glycerides. They have 3 long tails like this that are called glycerols, and fatty acids that connect them up here. This is a free fatty acid, and they bind together. So the building blocks of lipids are these free fatty acids. There are 2 main types of lipids. They're saturated and unsaturated fats. Saturated fats are full up with hydrogens. They have single bonds between every carbon in these chains, whereas unsaturated fats are not filled up with hydrogens. We can see them here. And they have double bonds between at least 2 of the carbons in the carbon chain. They come from different sources. Animal fats are saturated fats. They come in this configuration, whereas plant fats, so think about from things like avocados or olives, they come in this unsaturated fat form. You could also think about like monosaturated fats or polysaturated fats that are part of the meat and butter form. And so they exist in different states. So we can think about things like butter and steak or solids. versus olive oil, avocado oil, and so on, which are liquids. And so this is important because saturated fats increase the bad cholesterol, or high LDL, whereas unsaturated fats increase low cholesterol or low LDL. And so it's critical to know that not all fats are made the same, and it depends upon their saturation and these bonds. So the way that this works is basically these, since they're all the exact same, can just build right on top of one another, whereas these kink in the chains, they break up that structure, and so it ends up turning into a liquid. The next macromolecule we're going to talk about are proteins. Proteins are built from amino acids. There are 20 naturally occurring amino acids. 9 of them you have to get from your food. Amino acids build up proteins, which are the doers in our bodies. So everything that actually does something is protein. So you're talking about catalysts that make reactions happen. Some structure molecules, protein also, carbohydrates also contribute to structure. Transport, so if you have a pump that's trying to get a molecule from the outside of a cell to the inside of a cell, that's also protein. Antibodies, so fighting off antigens in your body, messengers, like hormones, and for example. So there are a wide variety of ways that that proteins function, and I think the easiest way to think about them is just as things that do things in the body. Proteins are really important. One thing interesting about proteins is that animals all require amino acids from their diet, and protein in animal cells is easier for people to access than protein in plant cells. So protein at plant cells obviously also have protein. They're also the doers in plant cells. And so for things like transports and enzymes within plant cells, we also have proteins. But they're harder for us to access. And so that's why when we think about the protein in meat, that it's easier to get protein, that there's more protein, and then even though there is a lot of protein in plant cells, we just can't access it as humans. Finally, we have nucleic acid. It's essential for life, but we don't need it within our diets. We have both single strand, this RNA, and double strand with the DNA. We've talked about this pretty extensively. They have slightly different nucleotide bases. RNA has uracil, where DNA has thymine. And RNA is transcribed from DNA in the process of transcription, which is in between DNA and protein. Obviously, our bodies produce some of the proteins that we need, right? So we've talked about the amino acids that we need to eat versus the amino acids that are naturally produced, and that makes sense because our bodies make a lot of proteins just based off of our DNA, and so the building blocks for those need to be within the body, and some of them are naturally occurring as well. Next week, we're going to transition and talking about micronutrients, which are also known as vitamins and minerals, like vitamin A, B, C, D, E. Lots of alphabet soup, as well as calcium, iodine, iron, potassium, sodium, zinc, which are coming off directly off the periodic table. And so macromolecules are not the only things that we need to be consuming in order to eat a balanced diet. And when we do not have the vitamins and minerals that we need, we end up with all kinds of health issues. And so we're going to dive a little bit into microdeficiency diseases, as well as some of the causality of disease. We'll see you then.